I have a secret, and that secret is that I really don't know how to use Photoshop. I've been creating content in Photoshop both personally and professionally for 5 years, but the truth is I only know the same 10 or so tricks, and I use them over and over and over again. I'm not saying what I do is anything that compares to somebody who's professionally trained, who does it professionally, who it's their passion. Photoshop is not my passion, but it's something that I recognize needs to be done and needs to be done well in order for the other things I'm passionate about to be discovered. That's really what we're going to try to do with this YouTube series, is take those 10 or so tips and tricks and try to apply some methodology to them and hopefully share them with you to help you create better images for your social media, for your YouTube, for your content, whatever it may be. Let's jump in and talk about the first one. So this first one is much less a trick and more of like a mindset. It's an idea to get some inspiration to get started. So what I did early on was I would find streams or YouTube videos that I really liked, and I would just examine what they were doing and find all the little details that you can. Doesn't mean you have to recreate them, but knowing that they're there and actually the effects that actually make a very professional looking stream or YouTube video tends to actually be in the most subtle parts of what they're creating and not just the overall color and design that people tend to want to go to. So what we're going to do is we're actually going to analyze one of my least favorite images I think I've ever made. And the reason why it's one of my least favorite, I think it looks fine, it looks good, but I just wasn't inspired to create it at all. I just knew that I needed to create something to get some buzz about the upcoming episode that we had on. And so I didn't have a lot of time. I made it in about 10 minutes. So this image right here, I put to work almost all the tips and tricks though that we're going to talk about in this video series to make a social media announcement and make it not look horrible. It's far from perfect for sure, but if I'm being honest, unless you're doing this full time, every minute you spend creating these non-essential items, but every minute that you're spending not creating the actual content that you're passionate about is a minute that you're not really doing what you're wanting to do. You have to do the not fun things sometimes, but that doesn't mean that you can't make them look great and put in the effort so that more people will come to your content. So let's break down a few of the tricks that I employ in this image right here. Fonts. Fonts. Everybody sucks at fonts. Not everybody, but so many people aren't ready to dive into the world of fonts. It's so obvious, and yet so many people get fonts wrong. Why? The first thing I think that happens is that people only use the system fonts installed in Windows. They're relying on Arial, Impact, and Helvetica, and these are fine fonts, but they're not really branding fonts. They're typically typeface fonts, except for Impact, which is a meme font. So if that's what you're going for, great. But there's a world of amazing fonts out there for you to use. Go to a website like dafont.com and just start looking at fonts. There's so many great ones, and you'll start to see the value that it can add to your images just by changing the font. The other thing that I noticed is that people use lowercase letters way too often for promotional images and branding. Most of the time, especially in like streaming and gaming and professional design, unless you're writing like a paragraph somewhere, you typically aren't going to be using a whole lot of lowercase fonts. It's not to say to never use that, but generally speaking, when you do, you kind of lose legibility a little bit. You lose a lot of the formatting, and it just doesn't end up looking as good. The third one is they use what's called a serif font too often. Fonts are generally broken up into serif, sans serif, and handwritten fonts. What a serif font is that it has a little projection to finish off the end of some of the letters. Times New Roman, we've all written that essay. That's a serif font. Lowercase letters and serif fonts are both kind of harder to read. They're harder to align, and generally they just make the image not look as good. So in the image above, I'm using a font called Havana. I actually purchased this font because I loved the font so much. It's a little bit narrower, so it fits into some spaces a little bit better and easier. It's called a condensed font. It's one that I like to use often. But I just want to emphasize that before we go into this any further, these are generalizations. This isn't saying never use lowercase letters, never use serif fonts. It's just that, generally speaking, if you look at an image and you notice something is off, these are the type of details that tend to really make them not look as good. Not all serif fonts are bad, but when you're considering and getting started out and you don't know Photoshop, and you don't know really how to align things properly, it's just going to make it harder for you to do that. So again, all generalizations, that okay. So let's go back to the image and what happens if I change the font of this image to a serif font and make it properly punctuated. So yeah, that's pretty bad, right? Yeah, it's bad. I can't even like say, oh, that's good. The background looks great, but the font immediately loses so much value, so much legibility. And, you know, if I was actually choosing to do a serif font, I would probably kind of change some sizing and things, but that's not the point here. The point is look at how much different this looks just with a font change. It doesn't fit anymore. So this is just an example, but there are some really good sans serif fonts that I can recommend you looking into. Montserrat, one is Havana, the one that we're using in the image. I purchased that again. I don't think it's available anywhere for free, but there's so many free fonts. Roboto and Roboto Condensed, Futura, and Industry. Those are the 5 fonts that I probably use the most often. Another really important tip that I wish I would have learned earlier on is textures and layering. Textures give your image depth and the appearance of detail. It's such a subtle, it's a really subtle thing that I didn't really catch on to it for the first couple of years. So let's look at the same image, and what we're gonna do is we're gonna just take everything off and look at my background layer. And all it is just a gray rectangle, dark gray rectangle. I try to avoid blacks at all time just because you run into contrast issues, but usually this is about as dark as I'll go for a black background, or the appearance of a black background. So keep that in mind. Usually never go all the way black, but there are some cases where I guess some people would do that, but that's just a side tangent. Sorry. So let's go back though, and let's add the other layers back minus the textures that I use for the background. So now what you can see is this it looks good. It looks fine. It's easier to read. You can see the content, but it's missing something, right? There's a lack of detail. Let's compare it to the original image so that you can see them side by side. And yeah, it's just kind of empty. And it's a fine balance. You can't make it too busy in the background, or your actual content, your actual announcement is something you're going to lose. But it is, it's a little empty here. So let's talk about what I did. So it's actually really easy. The first thing I did is I add a texture, and there's multiple ways to do it, but I think the simplest way is to just download a texture brush. Simply search for texture Photoshop brush, and you're going to get, brought to Brush Easy or some other website that has tons of different textures. If you know the specific texture that you want, you can be more specific, but generally you will kind of try to find just general textures that you kind of like, and then find out how they're classified so you know how to search for them again. So I found a texture brush called Grunge, and I normally don't like grunge, but I think really subtly all it is just adding like a little texture to it, and it isn't actually like grungy and gross like some of them are. So if I add the brush as is, so what I did is I added it on a white. I used a white color for it, and I added it, and I push it up just like this. And this is what it looks like when I just have the layer style as normal. It's definitely not what we're looking for, right? It looks ridiculous. But what happens if I change it to overlay? An overlay is a great way to add layer and texture to that. So you change your layer style to overlay, and we're getting a lot closer. We're getting a lot closer. We're definitely getting there, but it's still a little, I think, a little too aggressive in the background. It looks a little concrete wall, and that's not really what I'm looking for. I just want a little bit of texture and depth. So what I'm going to do then is I'm just going to reduce the opacity of it down to, I think this one's about 13%, and it looks like this. Way better. Way better. We're close. Still a little empty though, and this is another trick that I really like to use, especially when I'm using announcements and logos and things like that. Is all I did is I took the Florida Mayhem logo, I blew it up to just be about 20% larger than the screen, tilted it by about 30 degrees, and then threw the opacity down as well. What that does, it gives it this nice kind of continuity between the background and the foreground. It says, hey, it's the Florida Mayhem, more than just the little logo up in the top, and just kind of fills the space really well without drawing you away from that. So that's a trick I use in all sorts of the images that I create. I think the opacity on this is like 4%, and I made sure to put it below the texture layer so that the Mayhem logo gets texture as well. So there you have it. That's 3 quick tips to help your Photoshop. You'll notice that I didn't add, there's one more layer that I didn't talk about in my background that we're going to talk about in a future image or a future video. But there you have it. 3 quick tips to help you Photoshop like you know how, even though you don't. In the next video, I'm going to discuss layer effects, brushes, and spacing. These are all really important parts to making a great image. So if you like these videos and want me to do more of them, please take the time to hit the subscribe button, hit the little bell so you get notified when more videos come live. And until next time, good luck in Photoshop, and make sure to share with me what you've created.